Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 296 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. Today's episode is on lessons learned from working in a gender identity clinic. And it is Sunday, the 17th of November 2024 as I record this. So today's podcast episode is absolutely brilliant because in October 2023 I worked in a gender identity clinic doing some work experience for a few days, and it was one of the best work experiences I've ever had because it was really educational, and it was great to see the support available, the dedication, the need for research, and I learned so much from this work experience, which is definitely going to inform my clinical practice in the future, and it also gave me a lot of really valuable skills and soft experiences which I can use in future job applications. So I'm really happy about that. So even if you don't want to work in a gender identity clinic in the future, this is still a really valuable episode for you and your own clinical psychology journey, because it's gonna explain how some NHS trusts do stuff, the different sort of experiences, and what a typical day in the life of a clinical psychologist can actually look like at different times. So this is a really valuable one that I cannot recommend enough. Of course, because this is a gender identity clinic, I'm going to get a lot of hate. I'm going to have a lot of hateful comments and a lot of hateful emails for it, but I'm doing it anyway because this was really valuable to my own clinical psychology journey. And even if this benefits one extra person, that means that I've done my job as a podcaster. So you've got that to look forward to in the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the psychology news section, we're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And the first one is, the older we get, the later old age starts. Whether it's a big birthday, a creaky knee, or realising you have no idea who the latest TikTok star is, it's easy to feel like you're getting old. Most of the time, that isn't the case. The perceptions of old age are, in fact, pretty malleable. According to new research, as life expectancy increases, so does our idea of when old age begins. Writing in Psychology and Aging, Marcus Wedstein and team explore how and when we perceive an age as old. They find that perceptions of old age have changed over the decades and can be subject to more personal factors such as how lonely we are, our health, and our own age. So whilst there's not a great amount that I can actually talk about in relation to this psychology news article, I can definitely add some personal experience to the personal factors bit, especially because I think that when it comes to us joking about old age, sometimes these jokes are always based on reality. For example, when my dad started to get a creaky joint, when he started to forget stuff, and when he was starting to lose his hearing. Thankfully, he's not lost his hearing, and thankfully his hearing is so much better nowadays. When that was happening in his early 50s, for example, we were all very much joking, saying that, oh, well, you've actually got old age now. So even though we said it in a joking context, sometimes we honestly do believe that old age starts in 50, compared to the 60s and 70s. So these really do all a change, and it really does depend on personal factors. So that's all that I can really add about that one. So the second one is really interesting. money can be weirdly motivating. Employers seeking to make their staff work harder have a couple of main strategies available to them. One is to offer performance-related pay incentives. The other is to use psychological techniques, such as offering more praise or encouraging workers to feel that high productivity is expected, that it's the norm. Researchers show that both can motivate people and improve their performance, but the latest large-scale egg experiments have suggested that monetary incentives are much more effective, note the authors of a recent paper in Nature Human Behavior. However, write Danielle Metalid and colleagues, the participants in these studies were almost entirely from the US. Taking the issue across cultures, the team find that those from weird backgrounds are actually far more motivated by the strategy than their non-weird counterparts. Now, as you know, I flat out love culture, and I flat out love understanding cultural differences. And considering that most of the Western world is very individualistic, so that they're more motivated by themselves and they're very much focused on themselves instead of the collective group, this makes a lot more sense. Because if you're from a culture that stresses that you need to look after yourself, you will need to only think about yourself, and that's the best way to actually be, then someone giving you more money is much more likely to actually benefit you as an individual. So you're more likely to do it. But when it comes to performance-based strategies and things that help the company, your workers, and your work in the environment as a whole, I can sort of see how non-weird counterparts might find that more motivating. Because if you're being highly productive, then you're going to benefit the company, so the companies are going to get richer, and that should hopefully benefit your co-workers and everyone else. So I definitely think that that's an interesting food for thought. And if you're interested in business psychology, then you might want to look at this in more depth. And the last one is the child-free, a neglected population. Open quote. Parenthood is often seen as life's ultimate goal, and choosing not to have children can be a radical rejection of an entrenched universal social norm. But what impact does that choice have on the people who make it? Are child-free people really the selfish, kid-hating, money-grabbing, homogenous group some people paint them as? As the latest fertility rates for England and Wales dropped to the lowest levels since the record began, Ella Rose investigates a subject close to her heart. Close quote. So I highly recommend you go to the BBS Research Digest website and you actually read this. So my personal thoughts is that thankfully there's a lot of research on the topic now, but I think it is an absolute myth that people who don't want children and people who are child free, they do not hate kids. They do not they are not money grabbing, and most importantly, they are not a homogenous group. People with a whole wide range of different reasons. For example, one of my favorite podcasters and authors, she's a child free, and the last thing that she hates is children, because she absolutely loves her niece, her nephews, and her friends are kids though. She's the least kid-hating person that you can probably ever meet. And is she selfish? No, absolutely not, because she's such a giving person. So I think that the very idea that just because you don't want kids that makes you an inherently bad person, I think is an absolute myth. I think it's disgusting that it's been propagated as that, and the idea that any group is homogenous is ridiculous, because we only have to look at a country, let alone a region, or even a town or a university, to realize how many differences there are between individuals. And also, people do it for a wide range of different reasons. Sometimes I know that some people don't have the money to actually have the kids. Other people want to do it for environmental reasons. Some people just don't feel like because of their own childhood that they can actually have like kids, and I know a few people like that. So I would say though that if you meet someone who is child free and they don't want kids, first of all, don't make it an issue because it's not an issue. But also, if you go onto the topic, just listen to them without judgment, because whatever their reason is, it's a valid reason to them, and you don't have to 100% agree with it. And it's always just interesting to hear about different people's life experiences and what they want out of life. So I hope you enjoy the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. A lot has happened this week, especially in terms of lots of different projects, and some of them are actually really fun though. So I'm still doing lots of outreach work at my university, so I've been doing lots of reading and support and lots of other activities this week, which has been a lot of fun. It's always really nice working with like different students. Also, this week I actually decided to draw on a bit of a paper, and this I really do recommend if you want to go into an applied psychology profession. So, because I want to go into like clinical psychology, and you've got the four main clinical populations of learning disabilities, working aged adults, people with learning disabilities, and older adults. Plus, you've also got to have research experience to go on to the clinical psychology doctorate. What I did was I got on a piece of paper and I wrote down my experience for all of them. Now, I have tons of research experience, probably a bit too many to be fair though. And then I looked at what my clinical experience is. I have barely any clinical experience. Thankfully, today's podcast episode actually counts. But that's something I've definitely got to focus on in 2025, because I really do want to build up my clinical egg-like experience now that I've recovered from my sexual violence and I'm doing a lot better mentally. So now that I'm able to do stuff a lot more, I'm definitely going to explore that more, and I'm going to try and get some work experience in primary and secondary mental health services. I actually might try and get some work experience in CAMS. Yeah, I actually need to see where the CAM services are in Kent. Anyway, though. So, something that I do recommend that you do on your psychology journey is you either keep a list, or now you actually take a stock about what is your experience and how is that going to help you to actually get to your end goal. Whether this is to become an educational psychologist, a researcher, a clinical psychologist, a business psychology, etc. And if you find out that you've actually got a long way to go in terms of an experience, what small thing could you do today to help change that? So it could simply be spending 5-10 minutes, maybe even half an hour, going on the line, finding different places that offer work experience, or it could be reaching out to one of your favourite psychology lecturers saying, hey, I really want to gain some research experience. Can I help you at all? What projects are you working on at the moment? That's something that you can definitely do. So that's tip number one. Something else that I've been doing is I've been doing my improvements for my outreach session, which is a degree for a day program, which some schools have actually booked onto, even though it's not finished. So basically, it's about experiencing a university degree, so a psychology degree, and packing it into a day. So it looks at what is psychology at university, what's the lecture, seminar, library, a research task, and it's a lot of fun. I really do like this session. Now that I've done the improvement, hopefully it really should just be like plain sailing now. So it's a lot of fun, and I really did enjoy it. So besides that, I've also been doing lots of other like fun projects, and I'm starting a different fiction and non-fiction projects for release in 2025. So it's a lot of fun, and life is really good, thankfully. So as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So you can always email me, connorwiley@connorwiley.net. You can leave a comment on the blog post at connorwiley.net/podcast, and you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi-wiley, or leave a comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn post. As always, I absolutely love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And today's episode has been sponsored by Clinical Psychology and Transgender Clients. So this is an absolute brilliant book that I flat out love because I wrote this last year, a few months after I realised that I was transgender and non-binary. So it's a lot of fun. I really do recommend it because it answers a lot of really good a question about trans mental health. How can we support transgender clients? And it talks a lot about the psychology bits, and I also go into quite a lot of depth about my own discovery and some of the different bits and pieces that I thought about in my own when I'm starting a slight socially transition. So it's really good. I really do recommend it, and it's a nice, really easy book that I understand. It's engaging, and it does really introduce you well into taking mental health and clinical psychology and working with transgender clients. So it's a really good introduction that I highly recommend. So that's Clinical Psychology and Transgender Clients, a guide to clinical psychology, mental health and psychotherapy. Available to all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and hardback version from Amazon, local bookstore or local library if you request it. And if you want the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence, now you can at selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, Every, and selected library systems like Baker & Taylor, Biblioteca, and Overdrive. So whilst buying books help to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, an absolute massive thank you to my patrons. Your support shows that you like the show and you want it to continue. And if you want to learn more and get access to tons of great rewards, now you can at patreon.com/The Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Con So that's enough of the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about lessons learned from working in a gender identity clinic. This is a brilliant podcast episode. I'm really looking forward to it because I learned a lot, and this is still one of the best clinical pieces of the work experience I've ever done. So let's dive into it. What is a gender identity clinic, and the first lesson? So simply put, and I actually think Bing defines a gender identity clinic rather well. Open quote. And this also comes from gic.nhs.uk/about us. A gender identity clinic is a medical facility that provides support and treatment to individuals who experience gender dysphoria. It accepts referrals from all over the UK for adults with difficulties related to gender. The clinic is a multidisciplinary administrative and clinical team, including psychologists, psychiatrists, endocrinologists, speech and language therapists, and nurses. They work together in order to provide holistic gender care, focusing on the biological, psychological, and social aspects of gender. Close quote. In addition, This is one of my first reasons why I quite like gender identity clinics as a psychology person, was they're very holistic, which, as I mentioned before on the podcast, is flat out critical to delivering the best possible care for our clients. This is even more for gender dysphoria because there is a psychological dimension too, but then there are the social and biological aspects which interact. It is only by interacting and looking at these three types of factors we can possibly hope to help our clients to the best of our abilities. Be it through hormone replacement therapy, so trans people can have the physical bodies that they want, or the psychological dimension, so they can increase their confidence and feel okay in their own bodies, or the social aspect by wearing gender affirming clothing. Addressing all these dimensions of a client's experience is flat out critical, and I'm really glad that this approach is baked into gender identity clinics. An overview of what I did in those 3 days. Before I start talking about some of the specific lessons I've learned during the 3 days, I wanted to give you an overview of what I did. Also, I should mention that in my experience, gender identity clinics are made up of psychology, speech and language therapies, general practitioners, which for our international audience, that's what the UK calls its doctors and nurses. And I think that's all of them. But as you can see, it is a very multidisciplinary approach, which is brilliant. Therefore, like most work experience, you'll give into one of the disciplines and you spend the day with them. So on Monday, I spent it with a brilliant nurse. Like, she was absolutely great. I've got a lot of respect and I have so much time for her. That I got on with, and I did learn a lot from her. When I first met her, she was looking over some blood tests from a woman who had just started hormone replacement therapy. So I got to learn about that, the different levels they look for, and the importance of liver function testing. Afterwards, the nurse had a video appointment with a woman to see how she was getting on, since it tends to be every 6 months, and the client gets a check-in appointment, so the clinic can make sure everything is okay, the client is happy, and see if anything has changed. This is when I learned that after a few years of being on hormone replacement therapy, the effects and changes start to level off, meaning for the first year or two, the client might notice a lot of changes because of the hormones, and this makes them really happy. Yet, then the effects start to level off. In addition, I learned during the call what the term pathway means in gender identity clinics. This is basically their route through the clinic, starting off with their assessment and diagnosis, all the way to whatever their desired end is. For example, if a client only wanted to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, then the pathway would be shortish for them because they would get the diagnosis and be discharged from the clinic. Yet, if someone wanted a diagnosis and then a gender affirming surgery, that would have a long waiting time on the NHS, then their pathway would be longer. And this was a great video call that taught me a lot about transgender people, how kind and helpful they are. And there was one thing in particular that the client said that still sticks with me in my mind. And from historical context, and this is even more useful to be honest, because I wrote this like a year ago. My work experience was around the time that the UK's governing political party had their party conference and broadcasted lots of foul, evil lies about transgender people to the nation, and it was a very depressing time to be trans. However, on the video call, the client mentioned how whilst the political atmosphere was upsetting, the vast majority in their experience couldn't care less that they're trans. And that was very affirming for me, because that is largely true, I think, because this topic is so politicized. Sometimes it's hard to remember that the vast majority of people are okay and they support trans people. I'll always be grateful for that reminder because I think that it does help me a lot. Then in the afternoon, I was mainly sitting with a former placement student and going through a lot of their research, something I'll talk about later on because that is critical to understand. What happened on Tuesday? So, as a future clinical psychologist, I really enjoyed Tuesday. Like, the Tuesday is the main thing that really sticks with me. Because I've been checking out a lot of NHS assistant psychologists' job descriptions lately, and every single one of them requires you to have what's known as MDT egg experience. This means that jobs want you to have egg experience in multidisciplinary meetings. So on Tuesdays, I went to one, and it was brilliant in a very nerdy sort of way. So we all went into this really big conference room, and we sat around a table, and everyone was there more or less. You had the clinical leads, the head of the service, who was a brilliant clinical psychologist. You had speech and language, psychiatrists, nurses, and so on. And one of my favourite bits was that there were 3 homemade biscuits being passed around, as it was close to Halloween. Therefore, for the next 90 minutes, everyone spoke about their cases, they wanted to bounce ideas off each other, and there were some good discussions. Granted, a lot of the cases which I saw were just double checked, like their professional would tell everyone their thoughts, and because everyone is really good at their jobs, there was nothing to point out or problems with their thinking. Towards the end of the meeting, a nurse joined us online, and she was going through her caseload, and there were some more complex cases, and they were really interesting to listen to. Personally, I was surprised how long this EMDT meeting went on for, but that was only because I've never been to a MDT meeting before. Yeah, I was talking to a nurse later on, and some MDTs that go on for 3 hours, and I think that was a record at that particular service. As a result, I really enjoyed this experience because it gave me critical experience that will hopefully benefit my future career as a clinical psychologist. Then, at the rest of Tuesday, we were sitting in on appointments like a Monday and making sure that clients were okay, which was great. As well as I was sitting with a placement student, and we were talking for hours about different aspects of the service and client experiences, including some interesting research that the service was doing. What happened on Wednesday? So before this work experience, I had no idea there were small versions of MDT meetings because at this service there are things called huddles. These typically happen on a Wednesday, and these are meant for less complex cases that people will take along so that they can still talk about them and get ideas, but they don't need the level of insight that a large-scale MDT meeting provides. Also, these huddles have required the presence of at least 3 different professions. In our huddle, we had psychology, nursing, and psychiatry, and I think speech and language therapy might have made an appearance too. Again, this is another good piece of experience for me as it shows how the NHS works, how dedicated everyone is to multidisciplinary and holistic approaches to transgender care. And it also shows me that you can adapt and come up with some new ideas to solve problems within problems. For example, if every single case had to go through MDT, then I imagined, and this isn't a fact, that those meetings would be rather time consuming. So coming up with the huddle idea means everyone can use their time more effectively. Finally, besides from sitting in on some appointments, I had one of the most important conversations I will ever have as a future clinical psychologist, and even I keep coming back to this, as it really did show me how the NHS commission services worked. So I was talking to this wonderful female GP, and she used to be a commissioning officer for NHS England, and we were talking about gender identity clinics, how they're set up and whatnot. I'll talk more about that in the research section, but she was talking about how on paper, services might hypothetically cost a lot of money, but in reality, gender identity clinics are so cheap and very affordable for the NHS. Since we know from research, and I've mentioned this on a previous podcast episode, that gender affirming practices save lives, decrease suicide rates, and improve the mental health of transgender people. Therefore, these gender identity clinics perform these affirming practices and a treatment. And if we talk in code calculations that all policymakers seem to love, these services means transgender clients are far, far, far less likely to commit suicide, meaning that they can work, pay tax, and contribute to the economy, something policymakers are always interested in. Therefore, if you compare the amount of money spent on gender identity clinics and the money transgender people pay in tax and other economic activities whilst working, then gender identity clinics become very cost effective for the NHS and society as a whole. Furthermore, possibly one of the most sobering reminders of why this area is so important is because transgender children are committing suicide a lot more now. Since the GP was telling me that ever since the UK government decided to shut down the Gender Development Service, which is the UK's under 18 gender dysphoria service, the children on the waiting list for treatment has reached double-digit suicide rates for the first time. When the service was open, the suicide rates for children were in single figures. As a result, I will never let this go, but the fact is clear that when transgender healthcare is restricted, this kills people. And in this case, transgender healthcare is being restricted to children increases the chance of them dying. Personally, even as I was writing that section, I was getting upset because I never want to have this a conversation. It isn't natural to talk about child suicide, but because of the foul and awful decisions of our policymakers and politicians and other people that know less, we have to talk about child suicide rates. And as much as it upsets me, it also gives me more determination to do something to help people and improve lives. Lessons learned from working in a gender identity clinic. So, in addition to the lessons that I've already mentioned above, I want to talk about some specific lessons that I've learned during these 3 days and why they're important to current or future clinical psychologists. The people who work in mental health. I think one of the most important things to recognise is just how amazing and brilliant people are who work in mental health settings, because I've worked in the NHS settings before, and everyone in the NHS is extremely kind, compassionate, and they truly want to do what's best for their service users. This is exactly what I expected, and I didn't really think about it too much, because this is exactly how people who work in mental health should be. However, this could be my upbringing, where I live in the world, and the mainstream media, but I was really pleased to see how supportive, passionate, and dedicated the workers at the Gender Identity Clinic are. I know this shouldn't have come as a surprise for me, but professionals who work at Gender Identity Clinics are some of the nicest, most passionate, and hard-working people I've ever had the pleasure of working with. Therefore, I think this is really important to realise as current or future clinical psychologists, because sometimes I think we don't understand that there are other people who are just as passionate about psychology as ourselves in the world. For example, I'm currently doing my clinical psychology masters, and I'm very passionate about the topic, hence the podcast and my books. But my passion comes through in different ways compared to other students. So sometimes I do feel a minor disconnect between myself and other psychology students. So it's nice going into the clinic and meeting other professionals who are just as passionate about the area as me. Understanding comorbidity. If you understand clinical psychology, then you might have come across the disconnect in clinical psychology between academic research and real world implications. For example, academic research empirically focuses on a single mental health condition and excludes participants from research who have two or more mental health conditions. And this is great for research purposes, because this allows us to focus on the effects and treatment outcomes for one single condition. Yet in reality, humans are rarely that clean cut because of comorbidities, where someone has two or more conditions. And this is something I found really interesting about the MDT meetings on Tuesday, because I got to hear about this in an applied setting. As well as I am having to be a little vague here, because this is a sensitive topic for a lot of clients, so I will not be sharing too much publicly. Yet, once you start working in the mental health settings, you'll start to see, appreciate, and understand it is rare to see someone with a single mental health condition, because humans are not that simple. As much as I want to elaborate on this section, I need to refrain from doing so, because I was told this podcast episode will attract a lot of haters that might try to misquote me in an effort to hurt the amazing clients that myself and the services are trying to help. Need for research. Something I found really interesting about gender identity clinics is that they are so politicized. They are so judged by the government, and all the transphobes are looking for any excuse to shut down these life-saving services. There is a massive focus on research within gender identity clinics. Now, I have seen the NHS focus on research before, because research is a critical part of healthcare, but gender identity clinics thankfully take this to another level. Additionally, when I asked about why there was such a focus on research, I was told the following, but I need to reword it for our international audience. A few years ago, there was a legal case brought forward by a transgender client who basically accused the Tavistock clinic of trying to push the client through transitioning and a whole bunch of other stuff. The Tavistock Trust lost the case unfortunately, because the trust couldn't provide evidence for the effectiveness and life-saving nature of gender-affirming practices, as well as because this was a court case against the gender identity clinic. The mainstream media focused a lot of attention on it, and they did a very thorough job on reporting it. Further, adding to the false public narratives that turn public opinion against these critically important services. Overall, this was a landmark court case in the UK, because this was the legal case that was instrumental in bringing down the gender identity development service for under 18s. Remember earlier when I mentioned those increasing rates of child suicide? This court case was a major factor behind it. As a result, in an effort to prevent another court case being so easily lost, there is a massive focus on research being done by these services, because without this research that supports the gender affirming work these clinics do and the lives they save, there will be more court cases, more losses, and more clinics will be shut down, resulting in more trans people being denied the medical, social, and psychological services they desperately need in order to prevent the worst mental health outcomes, like suicide. And I do find this particular section upsetting, because I know as a trans non-binary person, as much as transgender healthcare in the UK is on a knife edge, and I know the consequences of what happens if the clinics go away, people will die. It is as simple as that, and I find that distressing, but it also hardens my resolves about why I support trans people and trans healthcare as much as I possibly can. Overall, there is always a massive need for research in clinical settings, but even more so in gender identity clinics. And one thing I have learned from this work experience is the importance of research, and how research has the power to save services and all the good they do in the world. so I will never take on adducting research for granted again. And that's actually quite funny, thinking about that, considering how much research I've actually done now. Like, I'm on my third transgender mental health study myself now, and it's a lot of fun. I've got at least 2 more studies that are coming next term. Know and learn more than you think. Finally, I've written about this before in a few places, but there will be times when you realise you know a lot more than you think. For example, there's a tiny egg abstract from Clinical Psychology Reflections Volume 4 that came out in March 2024 that introduces this topic well. Open quote. The idea for this reflection actually comes from a perspectives evening that I attended with some friends after a long day of testing on participants, as well as the university wanted us to believe otherwise. This entire event was the university just marketing itself and wanting to keep us on. They had a forensic psychologist, social psychologist, cognitive people, and a bunch of clinical psychologists there. And after helping myself to free pizza and catching up with my final year project supervisor socially, I went back over to my friends to see they were talking to a lecturer of mine, a clinical psychologist. And what really struck me were the questions they were asking. They weren't dumb questions, they weren't ignorant questions. Well, they're ignorant. And they weren't questions that made me question why they wanted to go into clinical psychology. They were simply basic questions that they would have known if they had taken clinical psychology modules. Close quote. And my point here is that if we're listening, trying to learn, and we're actively engaging in learning or any sort of work aspects, then you naturally pick stuff up that you don't realize that you're learning. The example above contains a lot of stuff about that I had learned in clinical psychology that I considered basic, but in reality it was specialist knowledge that I was surprised other people with an apparent interest in clinical psychology didn't know. I was reminded about this again during my work experience because on the Wednesday after I returned to Kent, I went to a trans social group that I go to, and there were a few conversations. I was surprised I was able to follow the conversations perfectly. I could actually have conversations back in quite a lot of depth because it just struck me how much I had actually learned in those 3 days. As a result, my point is, whenever you do psychology work assessments, you may think you didn't learn anything, but in reality, you probably learned a lot more than you ever thought possible. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. I know that I did because even though I wrote this a year ago, I still stand by everything that I've said. And now I've done trans mental health research on 3 different areas of social transitioning, and then there's 2 more bits that I want to explore by the end of my masters. And so this has really empowered me. This has got me excited, and I love my research. I love trans people. I love interacting with them because they're amazing, and mental health services are really good too. They're never going to be perfect, but there's so much more passion there, and I really do enjoy working with them. And this has actually revitalized me in terms of, oh, I really do want to work in clinical psychology in the future. So if you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, definitely check out Clinical Psychology and Transgender Clients, available in all the usual places. And if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis, then please check out patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. If you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then please buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwiley.net. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.